The ocean has claimed more lives than any battlefield in human history. Beneath its endless blue surface lie the broken remains of vessels and the stories of sailors who met ends so horrific that they still echo through maritime legend centuries later. These are not tales of heroic sacrifice or noble deaths in service to country. These are accounts of men trapped in steel coffins as water rushed in around them, sailors burned alive in floating infernos, and crews who watched their shipmates disappear into the depths one by one. Throughout naval history, the sea has proven itself an unforgiving executioner. When ships meet their doom, death rarely comes quickly. Instead, sailors face prolonged agony as their vessels transform from symbols of human engineering into underwater tombs. The worst naval deaths combine the terror of drowning with the additional horrors of fire, explosion, crushing pressure, and the psychological torment of knowing escape is impossible. What makes these maritime tragedies particularly disturbing is how the ocean itself becomes an accomplice to suffering. Unlike land-based disasters where rescue might arrive within hours, ships often sink far from help in water so deep that survival becomes a mathematical impossibility. The very element that carries these vessels also becomes their grave, swallowing evidence and leaving families with nothing but uncertainty about their loved ones' final moments. The first case that demonstrates the ocean's capacity for cruelty occurred during the height of the Age of Sail. In 1707, Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel commanded a fleet of 21 warships returning to England after successful operations in the Mediterranean. The ships were loaded with battle-hardened sailors who had survived months of combat, their holds filled with treasure seized from enemy vessels. These men had faced cannon fire and sword fights, believing they had cheated death and were heading home to families and fortune. As evening fell on October 22nd, thick fog began rolling across the English Channel. Navigation in this era relied on dead reckoning and celestial observation, both useless in the dense mist that now surrounded the fleet. The admiral's navigators believed they were safely west of the dangerous Isles of Scilly, but the fog had deceived them. They were actually sailing directly toward jagged granite rocks that had claimed countless vessels over the centuries. The first ship to strike was HMS Association, the Admiral's flagship. The massive warship, carrying over 800 men, hit the rocks with tremendous force. The impact tore through her hull like paper, and within minutes, seawater was pouring into the lower decks. In the darkness and confusion, sailors scrambled toward the upper decks as their ship began its death roll. The weight of the cannon on the gun deck shifted as the vessel tilted, crushing men against bulkheads and creating a thunderous cacophony that mixed with the screams of trapped crew members. Admiral Shovel himself was thrown from his cabin as the ship lurched. Still wearing his dress uniform and ceremonial sword, he fought his way through corridors that were rapidly filling with water. Around him, sailors clawed desperately at each other in their panic to reach the hatches. The ship's surgeon later described seeing men's faces illuminated by lantern light as water rose around their necks, their expressions frozen in terror as they realized their fate was sealed. Within 20 minutes, HMS Association had completely disappeared beneath the waves. Of the 800 souls aboard, only one man survived. He managed to grab a piece of floating debris and endure hours in the frigid water before washing ashore on St. Mary's Island. His account provided the only witness testimony to the horror that unfolded as the flagship sank. But Association was not alone in her destruction. HMS Eagle struck the same rocks moments later, her crew having no time to react to the disaster unfolding just ahead of them. The 70-gun warship carrying 350 men suffered an even more violent end. When she hit the granite outcropping, her powder magazine exploded, sending burning debris across the water and illuminating the fog with orange flame. Sailors from other ships in the fleet reported seeing bodies thrown hundreds of feet into the air by the blast, their silhouettes briefly visible against the fire before disappearing into the darkness. The explosion that destroyed Eagle created a rain of burning wood and canvas that fell on HMS Romney. The third ship to meet disaster that night, Romney's crew had watched in horror as their sister ships vanished, but the fog prevented them from changing course in time. They struck with such force that the ship's mainmast snapped and crashed down onto the deck, crushing dozens of sailors instantly. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves trapped beneath tons of rigging and canvas as water flooded through the massive breach in the hull. HMS Firebrand, a smaller vessel carrying 40 men, managed to avoid the main rocks, but struck a submerged ledge that punctured her bottom. Her crew had precious minutes to contemplate their fate as water slowly filled their ship. Unlike the violent ends of the larger vessels, Firebrand sailors experienced the psychological torture of watching death approach gradually. They had time to write final letters, pray with the ship's chaplain, and say goodbye to their messmates before the sea claimed them all. The morning sun revealed a scene of unprecedented maritime destruction. 4 proud warships had vanished completely, taking nearly 2,000 men to the bottom. Among the bodies that washed ashore was Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel himself, still breathing but barely clinging to life. Local inhabitants found him on the beach at Porthhellick, his ornate uniform torn and his body battered by hours in the churning sea. According to legend, an island woman discovered the admiral's emerald ring and strangled him as he lay helpless on the sand, ending the life of one of England's most celebrated naval commanders, not in glorious battle, but in an act of petty murder after surviving the worst maritime disaster in Royal Navy history. The psychological impact on the few survivors who made it to shore was devastating. Seaman Thomas Pellow, one of only 26 men to escape the 4 ships, spent the rest of his life haunted by the sounds of his drowning shipmates. He described hearing voices calling for help in the darkness long after the ships had disappeared, the fog carrying the screams across the water like ghosts refusing to be silenced. Pellow never returned to sea, spending his remaining years as a broken man who would wake screaming from nightmares of water filling his lungs. But the silly naval disaster pales in comparison to the horrors that awaited sailors as naval technology advanced. The introduction of steam power and iron hulls in the 19th century created new forms of maritime death that were previously unimaginable. Steam boilers turned ships into floating bombs, while iron hulls meant vessels sank faster and deeper than ever before. The worst of these technological terrors occurred during the American Civil War, when the steamboat Sultana became a floating crematorium on the Mississippi River. On April 27, 1865, the Sultana was packed with over 2,400 passengers, mostly Union soldiers recently released from Confederate prison camps. These men had survived the horrors of Andersonville and Cahaba, enduring months of starvation and disease. They believed their suffering was over as they boarded the vessel that would carry them home to families they hadn't seen in years. The ship was designed to carry only 376 passengers, but greed and corruption had led to massive overcrowding as officials collected bribes to pack as many paying customers as possible onto the vessel. At 2 a.m, the Sultana's boilers exploded with a force that could be heard for miles along the riverbank. The blast tore through the center of the ship, instantly vaporizing dozens of soldiers who had been sleeping near the engine room. Superheated steam filled the lower decks, scalding men alive as they tried to escape through passages that had become death traps. The explosion hurled burning coals across the vessel, igniting the wooden superstructure and trapping hundreds of passengers in a rapidly spreading inferno. Former prisoner of war William Fies watched in horror as flames engulfed his fellow soldiers. Men who had survived Confederate prison camps were now burning alive, their screams mixing with the roar of flames and the hiss of escaping steam. Fies saw soldiers jump overboard rather than face the fire, only to discover that many of them couldn't swim after months of physical deterioration in prison. The Mississippi's cold current pulled weakened men under within seconds, their heads disappearing beneath the surface as stronger swimmers desperately tried to save them. The survivors who made it to shore that night never forgot the sounds of nearly 2,000 men dying in fire and water. Those screams echoed across the Mississippi for miles, a horrific symphony that marked one of America's worst maritime disasters. Yet even today, the Sultana tragedy remains largely forgotten, overshadowed by Lincoln's assassination just weeks earlier. These stories remind us that the sea keeps its secrets, and the worst naval deaths in history continue to rest in silent darkness beneath the waves.